Hi, everyone, and now welcome to Lecture 7. Basically, we have finished the first half of the course in which we looked at critical reading, summarizing, and, those types of things. Now we're moving towards the second half, which will be all about your final research paper. I mean, there'll be a couple of other little things we'll be doing as well, such as another grammar quiz. But now we're moving into some more sophisticated areas of the writing process. So what we're going to do in lecture 7 today, we're going to look at definition and paragraphing. Now, that might seem a bit obvious, paragraphing, right? But the fact is, most of you have been taught the 5-paragraph model in high school. And as I've suggested to you before, that simply won't work with longer papers. So we have to start thinking about, how paragraphing works, what makes an effective paragraph, and we'll get into that in the second part of the lecture today. But we're going to begin with definition. I believe there's one other thing we're going to be doing as well near the end. I think I've got, I'll show you outlines, of course, right? Because that's going to be the next assignment, major assignment. So we'll look at outlines, and I'll be giving you tips, etc. But you're going to find that with the outline, like every outline is going to be different. I'm simply going to give you a structure of how you put an outline together. All right, you'll see what I mean when we get into it. So let's start then with definition. All right, now, when do we define? How do I know when to define terms? Okay, I'm writing an essay. On the 4th page of the essay, I introduce a word. I don't introduce, a word is included, and the word is somnambulist. Okay, now that's not a common word. I know some of you know what it means, but many people don't. Should I define that? Well, in fact, no. Why not? Well, if we find it on the 4th page of your essay, okay, think about that for a moment, then it probably hasn't been the central focus of the essay to begin with, right? So just because you introduce a word that maybe the reader doesn't understand, it's not up to you to define every sophisticated term. Sometimes the reader will have to pick up a dictionary and figure it out. So that's what I'm trying to show you today. So in other words, when do we define? When don't we? Okay, or actually better, when do we? Okay, that's what you really want to know. All right, okay. So let's think about this for a moment. Let's just look at your notes now. Okay, I'm going to elaborate quite a bit in this lecture. All right, but knowing when to define, how to define is just as important, right? It's a very important skill, because through definition, you kind of create meaning and agreement between you, the writer, and the reader. So, and you'll see exactly what I mean as we go through all of this. All right. Sorry, I got off to a funny start there. My allergies are acting up, right? So I might have to pause just once in this lecture. Okay. Okay. So anyway, there are 2 basic ways of defining. You've got that right there in your notes, right? There's the short way and the long way. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the short way because that's the one you'll need for at least the first 2-3 years of your university career. You won't really need to worry about the long way until you get into maybe graduate school, more than likely, all right? I will tell you, though, what it means, all right? But let's just look at a couple of things here, okay? The short way is called formal definition. It's a formal definition. And that's the one that you're used to, right? If you were to define something. So the writer explains in a sentence, right? Maybe a word that maybe, now in the notes it says maybe unknown to the reader, but I'm going to elaborate on that, okay? That almost sounds like a contradiction of what I just said, but notice the writer explains in a sentence a word that may be unknown to the reader. But wait, okay? You should include a definition whenever you introduce an unfamiliar word, concept, or whenever you assign a particular meaning to a general term in the thesis. So there's your golden rule. Will there be other times where you might have to define in your paper? Sure, of course there will. But if you have, let's go back to it. If you have a term, and I've got tons of examples to give you. Let's just say you have a word that might be, could be misconstrued, could be interpreted in different ways. You want to make sure that you define what you mean by that term, for instance, if it is just a term, very clearly so the reader understands, right, what you mean and where you're going. That's what I mean by agreement. You're making agreement between you and the reader. So, as I said, if you feel the need, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment, if you feel the need, if there's a word in your thesis and you know, okay, that has more than one meaning, let me just jump ahead just a bit so you understand. Let's just say we use the word globalization. That can mean very different things to different individuals. It can be a very positive thing, it can be a very negative thing. If you were to have a word like that in your thesis, you might then want to make sure you define exactly what you mean in the paper. Where would you do that? You would do it, run back to the notes now, in the very first sentence of the second paragraph, okay? The first body paragraph. There's no point in writing a page or two using that term and then all of a sudden defining it. No, you must set up the terms of agreement for the reader, okay? And you should do that early on. And as I said, it's right there, okay? In the first sentence of your second paragraph, the first body paragraph, all right? If you don't, you say ambiguous words or phrases that could take on different meanings. Then, as I said, you simply leave the reader wondering, well, what exactly do you mean by that? I could give you a perfect example right now. This would come more for in a literature course, but irony. Think of a word like irony. Everyone thinks they know what that means, but people misuse that term all the time. Irony simply means the duplicity of meaning. Okay, duplicitous. It means working on two different levels, two or more different levels, right? And so you can have, again, I could give you some raunchy examples. I won't, but just think of a soliloquy in Shakespeare. You all probably studied Shakespeare, at least one play in high school. Well, in a soliloquy, the character who's giving the soliloquy gives information to the audience that the rest of the individuals on stage don't know. So now there's two different levels of meaning operating within the play. What's happening on stage, but what you also know in your mind that the other characters don't. That's one quick example. There are many different forms of irony. Okay, I don't want to belabor that. I'm simply saying there are certain words you can throw them in at the beginning of a paper thinking, oh, everyone will understand what I mean by that. No, be careful, all right? So, and as I said, you don't want ambiguity in your essay, okay? Remember, we're talking now about the final research essay, okay? You do not want ambiguity. You want to be clear exactly what you mean. And as I said, this may not even apply to some of you, right? But for the most part, I have a feeling it will. Just be aware of that. Now, and so the formal definition, I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, the second way to define is something called extended definition, okay? In which maybe a word or an idea or a concept becomes the entire paper, right? But as I said, for an undergraduate paper, chances are maybe fourth year, maybe, but chances are you won't need to worry about that. But there are some terms, though, where literally the entire essay could be the subject of that one word, okay? Or could be that one word as the subject. So, again, I've done this lecture so many times, I am going to jump a bit ahead. If you want an example of that, think of a word like metaphysics. Okay, what does metaphysics mean? Okay, and again, we could take hours talking about that, couldn't we? Do we mean it from a philosophical perspective? Do we mean it from a poetry perspective? So scientific. So as I said, you want to be careful in terms of agreement and meaning. Just be aware of it. That's all. Just be aware of it. Okay. And so, definition then answers the question, what does S mean? Where, of course, right, S becomes the subject or the term, right? Then there's my example of metaphysics right there. Okay. And so that's a term that you could define in one sentence, right? Like if you found a really good definition, but you could also write a book. Another example would be modern. Many of you probably understand what I mean by modern. Many people think modern is the equivalent of contemporary, but that's not necessarily true, especially when it comes to the arts, right? Architecture, okay, painting, literature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So I think I made the point on that. So as I said, extended definition, you can always look that up if you need it. You won't need it. You shouldn't need it for your final research paper for our course. Okay, you shouldn't need it. So let's go back then. A formal definition. Well, where would I find a really good definition, right? Well, our first response would be, let's just go to a dictionary. Dictionaries are not always the best, though, all right? As you progress in your university career, you will find that whatever discipline you are in, there will be reference texts, all right? That's usually where you'll want to go eventually, not necessarily in this course for first year, but eventually you'll want to go to reference texts, which give much more specific definitions about concepts and terms, etc. So be aware of that. Now, I'm not asking you to go out and buy a reference text right now, all right? They're very expensive. But once the university library opens up again, then you can always go in. There is a reference section there. You can find these things online as well. Okay. For myself, if I was doing, say, a paper on literature, I might use something like the Encyclopedia of Literary Theory or Literary Terms or what have you. But as I said, every discipline has them. So again, don't worry about that for our course, right? For a first year course. But do become aware that, especially when you know which area of study that you will explore, when you're positive of your major, all right, your discipline, then you might want to start figuring out or looking around, finding which reference texts seem to be the best. All right. In fact, there's for our course here, if I wanted to, I could have asked you to buy a book that is, I believe it's over $100 now, and it's not very big, $100, and it's actually called the Gregg Reference Manual. You can find it online, and that's one of the best books that you can find on style, grammar, a ton of other things as well. All right. So, but as I said, I didn't ask you to. First year course, not going to ask you to do that. Okay. So here we go. Basically, then, yeah, the extended definition. Then, as I said, I don't know why that seems a bit out of place there. But when you're talking about, like, going back to the point I was making about how you could write a whole book, the change meaning of words, right? Or you could talk about like the technical aspect of a certain word, the abstract. All right. Anyway, but here's a couple of the words though that I was thinking about. Right? Globalization, justice. Think about a term like justice. Man, that term can mean so many things to so many different people, right? Yeah, again, we know this stuff just from living in the world that we live in today. Okay? What is justice? All right? So there you go. But even though those words might be useful, I'm sorry, even though you may need to use words like that for an extended definition, they would certainly work for a formal definition as well, right? If you started off in your paper, in your thesis, and you said so and so did not get justice or did not deserve justice or whatever, okay, that's probably an example then where you might need a sentence at the beginning of the second paragraph saying, what exactly is justice? I know this sounds obvious. It's not. This, again, there's so many different ways to look at certain words. I think justice is a perfect one, considering the world we live in today. I won't say anything more than that. All right? Okay. So I think I'm going to move to page 2 now. All right? So if you know the history of language, the word define actually comes from the Latin. And literally, if you look at the translation of the word, it means to put a fence around. So really, can I say that a bit differently? When you define your terms, you set up the parameters of meaning. Notice what I'm doing there? There's your fence, the parameter. Okay, you set up the parameters of meaning. That's how definition works. So there you go. All right. And so it's interesting how it's something we take for granted, but don't, especially for your final research paper, your take home. I'm going to be using those terms interchangeably for the rest of the course. We all know what I mean by that. Now, in this portion of the course, we're literally moving towards your essay. All right. I'm going to have lots of hints. I'm going to show you a whole lot of things, lecture 7 and 8 especially. There'll be tons of things I'm going to show you. Okay. So let's just start today, like as I said, with definition and paragraphing, and then outlines, because as I said, that's the next thing we need to worry about. Okay. So how do we construct a formal definition? That's kind of what I was hinting at just a second ago. Well, you start to ask yourself then, all right, how do I define? Well, you want to avoid vague formulations. And the silly example I have there is a turtle. How do you define a turtle? Well, a turtle lives in water. Okay. Obviously, I don't think that's going to be good enough. All right. Okay. You get it. All right. Try not to begin with a word for word definition copied straight out of a dictionary. As you start to get more sophisticated in your writing, as I said, you might want to go somewhere else, right? Maybe if you've already taken a couple of first year courses, right? And let's just say you're using a psychological term. Well, instead of going to a dictionary to define the term, maybe go to a psych text, right? That might be one way, right? But there's many different ways of doing it. And believe it or not, a psych like your introductory to psychology, your textbook, that actually is closer to a reference text than a dictionary. So you want, as I said, you want to just start thinking about that, all right? And by the way, if you do feel the need to define and you use a dictionary, please don't give a phrase something like Webster's dictionary defines X as, okay? Try to get a bit more sophisticated in your writing than that, okay? Again, we're going to talk more about that in the next couple of lectures, okay? All right. So Yeah, as an introductory strategy, then yeah, a dictionary definition, they usually don't do the job very well. It's so true, especially when you think of psychology. And now I'm thinking more about psychology and say literature or something like that, right? You want to avoid dictionary terms as best you can. They're just too they're just too vague, right? Too general. General is a better word there. So watch out for that. Okay. Funny how you can see the sun creeping in here, right? But anyway, I'll try and stay away from that. All right. And so it is your meaning that you intend. Let's go back then to irony. Irony can mean so many different things. Make sure you're clear which one you are using. All right. I actually had an essay in another class, and the student was defining irony. And so the student actually listed all of the different definitions of irony, but never actually said which one that they would be using. Okay, you don't want to do that. You pick the meaning you need for the purposes of your argument. Okay, make it clear to the reader, and then work it through. Okay, or I shouldn't say work it through, but set up the foundation. All right. It's funny. We'll come back to that word foundation at the end today. All right. Okay. And so avoid, obviously, using the definition, the word in the very word that you're trying to define in your definition. You all know that. That's what's called a circular definition. So the example I have there, adolescence is the state of being an adolescent. I don't think that's going to help the reader if the reader doesn't know what adolescent means. Okay, so watch out for that as well. Okay, I like that one actually. Okay, and so finally, then a really good definition. And as I said, some of you will need it, some of you may not. But a really good definition really sets up. It establishes clearly, okay, logically and precisely the boundaries of meaning. All right, I'm right there near 3/4 of the way down. It simply communicates to the reader, okay, the appropriate terms of agreement from the writer to the reader. Okay, sorry about that. Now, a few hints. Do you remember going back to lecture number 2, I believe it was? No, it was 3. Okay, it was lecture 3. Okay, anyway, never put a word in italics or quotation marks. Okay, don't, and just leave it like that. Don't do that. Remember, I warned you about that before. Okay, so by putting it in italics, that doesn't give any stronger meaning stronger meaning to your intention. Okay, if you feel the need to do that, then maybe that's another place where you might need to define. Okay, so there's 2 right there that I've shown you now when to define. Okay, if you have that word in your thesis that may be controversial or ambiguous, okay, there's one place. Then in your essay, you have another word that you feel the need to put into italics or quotation marks and let it stand on its own. There's another example where you may need a definition or at least elaboration. Okay, if you remember back to lecture 3, we talked about that. So there you go. There's 2 very specific places now. There aren't too many others, right? Like I said, there will be times in more sophisticated papers where you will need to define, but there's 2 examples right there that we can zone in on and say, okay, at least I know in those cases I need to define. Okay, good. All right. And so, yeah, the rest there is basically like just make sure you are clear in your meaning. Simple as that. I could go on and say the same thing over and over again for another minute. What's the point? Be clear in your meaning. Set up agreement between you and the reader. Done. Okay? And so that then creates, as I said, the foundation. And I'll come back to that later. Now, one last thing, all right? Now that we're starting to actually write out formally, you might want to think as well about how to introduce an acronym. An acronym is simply when you have a set of words, but you want to abbreviate it somehow by just using the letters of that. Look at the example I have, all right? Let's just say you started in your second paragraph, you used the phrase, the United States of America. I use that example only because people don't tend to abbreviate or anachronize. I don't think that's a word. They don't tend to do that with Canada. But with the United States of America, that can take up a lot of room. And there are other titles or terms which take up, you may have 4 or 5 words. You don't want to keep saying it over and over and over again. Okay, here's how you do that. The first time you use the United States of America, let's just keep it simple. The first time you use it in the body of your essay, follow it with a parenthetical note and choose something that reflects the phrase you're using. So, US. Notice in the notes, US is capitalized. Put it in parentheses right after the word America, or right after the last word that you are choosing, okay, to use, okay, or to show, right, your acronym. Once you do that, feel free in the rest of the paper, okay, you can simply, when you want to refer to the United States of America, you can simply refer to it as US. You do not need the parenthetical notes anymore, the parentheses. You don't need them anymore. Okay? So you say it once, like the first time you do it, you put it in parentheses and give me an acronym, US. And then from here on in, you can simply use US. You don't need parentheses. That's how we do that. Again, what I'm going to try and show you in the next few lectures, how do we clean up our writing? Well, there's a perfect example right there. Okay? So, and I think I'm going to mention that again in lecture 8, just to remind you. Okay, right? Yeah. Okay. So that's it. That's it. There's your definitions, including if you need an acronym. I think I said an acronym. Okay. That's another word, anachronistic. But anyway. And so two different things that we're thinking of when we think of definition, right? Okay. So yeah, I don't think I need to say much more than that. Okay. So gosh, that took 21 minutes already. Let's talk a bit about paragraphing, and I'm going to include a couple of things that we've already seen. I just want you to be able to access things when need be. A paragraph. Now, I know everyone thinks they know what a paragraph is, but my goodness, paragraphing has it's become a huge problem in writing, huge problem. And again, the reason for that is the 5-paragraph model. Again, I wish high school did not teach that to you guys, but they did. All right. So let's see if we can come up with some better rules. All right. Although I must admit, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to paragraphing. I just want to help you with your style. Right. Okay. So a paragraph is a group of sentences that focus on one main idea. Now, even that, and by the way, that's almost a textbook standard definition for paragraphing. Even that doesn't really explain what a paragraph does. I'm going to get into it a bit more. All right. Before we begin, when you hand in your final paper, make sure that each paragraph is indented, right? Tab. You hit the tab every paragraph, every paragraph. You will lose marks. You will lose marks if you start at the left-hand side and then have a huge space in between, okay, to indicate a new paragraph. That is not how you write a paper at the university, all right? So do not do that, right? We already fixed a few of those in earlier assignments, all right? So don't do that. Instead, you indent every paragraph, including your introduction, okay? I could get into a bit more with that when it comes to the Modern Language Association. Just take my word, just indent every paragraph, including the first. Don't email me about that. The Modern Language Association suggests that you don't indent the first paragraph. I know why. It's because they're talking about a PhD thesis that would include an abstract. And an abstract does not have an indentation in the first paragraph, all right? You're not writing a PhD thesis. Okay, not for this course anyway. Every paragraph, every new paragraph, including your introduction, should be indented. Tab, hit tab. That should bring it over 5 spaces. Okay, so don't hit your space bar 5 times. Hit tab. Okay, boom. So there's the first. Literally, you will lose marks for that because again, we're thinking about style. We're thinking about how I'm supposed to be teaching you how to put a paper together. Correct? Well, there's one thing we should be aware of right there. That's the kind of thing where I could look at a paper and know, oh, they did not pay attention to this at all. And you're losing marks. You're losing marks already. So watch out for that. Okay? That's where you should be highlighting, right? Indent 5 spaces, tab, right? And notice right there it says for undergraduate papers. Yes, it's a bit different when we get to graduate school, but you're not there yet if you're taking this course, I would hope, or I would think, I should say. All right? Okay, so you tab and then try and keep your focus. Now, it's easy for me to say that, okay? But if you follow everything I'm about to do in the rest of this lecture, well, it kind of makes sense because of the way I'm asking you to do your outlines. And by doing your outlines, I'm going to show you how we can break material down. Okay. I'm going to be referring to something that we've already talked about. Okay. All right. So the way I like to think about paragraphing, a paragraph should be divided into 3 different sections or areas. But I'm going to play with that in just a moment. I'm going to give you the fundamentals, then we'll play with it a bit. So the division, okay, of a paragraph, and I've got my favorite phrase when it comes to paragraphing. I made it up on my own. The division is very similar to the organization found in any essay, any academic essay. And so think about that for a moment. Well, what's the organization of any essay? You've got your beginning, your middle, and your end. Except we call it your introduction, your body, your conclusion. Boom, right? And boom goes the dynamite. Remember that one? Okay. So normally, if we were really starting with fundamentals of writing, which we are, but we're not, we would have a topic sentence. Then we would have your body sentences, okay, with your supporting your quotes and everything else. And then you would have a transitional sentence. As you get more sophisticated, you will find that you don't necessarily need an obvious transitional sentence for every paragraph, right? Especially when you start thinking about those longer papers I spoke about earlier, where you might have, say, 10 paragraphs for one area or section. Well, then you wouldn't necessarily need topic sentences for every paragraph. And you wouldn't need transitional sentences for every paragraph. But it would be a good idea, and I hope you're following. This is a bit abstract now, what I'm doing. But in fact, it would be a good idea to have a topic sentence and a traditional and transitional sentence. Topic sentence at the beginning of every section and a transitional sentence at the end of every section, right? So, topic sentence, imperialism. Remember the example we did before? So something about imperialism. Then at the end of a section, which might have been 5 pages, although imperialism benefited some nations, right? Remember I did that? There's your transition. So I'm tidying up one area, kind of wrapping up the area I was just dealing with, right? And now I'm suggesting where we're going. That's how these things work. So as I said, as you get more sophisticated, you start to see how we can play around with these things. Okay? All right. So try to remember, here's your golden rule. I'm not joking. A paragraph is a microcosm of the entire essay. Now, I'm going to move on from that, all right? And I'm not going to bother defining microcosm. Why? Because you see, you as the reader should have picked up a dictionary and figured that. I'm joking, all right? A microcosm simply means micro, small, right? Small. Cosm, world, or smaller representation of a larger thing. That's all a microcosm means, a smaller representation of a larger object, okay, or a larger concept or whatever. And so in this case, well, the microcosm, the paragraph, is a smaller representation of the essay itself. Each has 3 main components. Now, we have then, as I said, a topic sentence, right? It sets up the focus. That's a key word, by the way, in the last few in the coming lectures. This whole notion of focus becomes very important. When I start looking at the outline with you today, you'll see what I mean, all right? So we have, it sets up the focus and states, and in the notes it says, and it states what the paragraph is going to be about. But remember, it may be what the section is about. So you see, I can't just hand this stuff to you on a platter, right? You have to start reading between the lines and figuring out, okay, now I begin to see, right, how that all works. And as I said, every paper will be different, right? Every paper you write will be different. And that's why, again, you want to get out of the habit that you've been taught. You have your points and your whatever, and then your 3 points, and then you move on, and then you have your 3 points, and you move on. That's way too rigid, way too rigid. That just makes for obvious writing. The reader becomes really tired of that type of style. It just becomes tedious. It's like you're plugging in formulas. That's not the best way to be writing. So as I say, writing is a process, right? It's a process. It takes a while. So you have then, as I said, the topic sentence sets up the section or the paragraph, and then I'm in my notes I've suggested no quotes. All I really mean by that is never begin a paragraph or end a paragraph with quotation marks. Remember I talked about that. Move into quotes. So even if you feel the need to have some kind of quote in your first sentence of the paragraph, move into it with your own words. And we talked about that. Go back and look at some of the things we talked about in, I can't remember which lecture it was now, but when I had that whole paragraph on imperialism, I talked all about that. So think about that. Again, style. Content is important, obviously, in an essay, but so is style. And remember, I think the word I used was you want to get a nice sense of flow. Okay, you can't see my hand, but nice sense of flow to your essay. So all of these things matter for your overall grade of the final research paper. Okay. So you then have, I won't bore you on all this, you have your body sentences, right? In the middle, that's the meat, right? So your quotes and all of that. But remember, make sure you are still in that paper as well. I told you that before. Don't just throw out a quote after quote after quote or paraphrase, paraphrase, paraphrase. Don't do that. Instead, make sure you make it clear which words are yours, which words you're quoting. Okay? Again, I know there will be times where you need to paraphrase. I know. But do your best to always quote directly. Okay, you should have quotation marks in your paper. And then and that's exactly what we tried to show in the first half of the course, right? We forced you to make sure you were quoting, not just paraphrasing. You had to do both, right? So now keep that in mind as you do your final paper. That only makes sense, right? That's kind of the way the course is set up. It forced you to understand that to begin with. Now you know how to do it. Okay? And so finally, then the transitional sentence. As I say, like if you were to pick up a textbook, it would tell you have a transitional sentence at the end of every paragraph. But that gets that gets a bit tedious. You know what I mean? So again, you have to kind of pick and choose, but be aware of how they work. All right. Someone jokingly emailed me, by the way, and asked, "How come you use the same cup every time you're giving a lecture?" I wash it, for God's sakes. I just don't want fancy mugs in front of me. Okay. Although that one does have balloons or something on it. Anyway, all right. Okay. So in your notes now, I'm not going to go through all of this with you. I know that sounds odd, right? I'm giving you some reminders because you may not remember as we get into the second half of the course. Remember all of the different examples of how I showed you how to move into quotes, how to quote, how to paraphrase, and all that. I just thought it would be a good idea. I literally just copied and pasted the information that we had from that lecture, and I just included it again, just so okay, I can't find that or whatever. There it is, right there. So just keep in mind though, MLA does certain things, APA does certain things, right? We still haven't gotten to the works cited yet. Don't worry about that, all right? But again, we're talking now simply about the body of the essay for now. And so I included all of that there just for your own sake, all right? Yeah. So going back now to paragraphs. Paragraph size. Again, there's no rule that says that. I was taught it's amazing what we are taught. I'm sure some of you were told 7 sentences, 6 sentences, 5 sentences. I mean, none of that makes any sense, right? Every paragraph is going to be different, right? Like they simply will. I mean, sometimes. Okay, here's a tip for you. Okay, that is not in the notes. Let's just say you're used to the 5 paragraph model. Ask your once you've written a draft and you do have your 3 body paragraphs, which are huge, right? Ask yourself, could I break that up? Is there some place where I'm kind of talking about one thing and I'm still talking about the same idea, but I'm talking about it from a different aspect? That's exactly how you start to figure out better paragraphing. I'm going to give you even more specific stuff in just a second, all right? But think about that for a moment. Your paragraphs, some of you will hand in, you're not going to do very well, but you will hand in paragraphs that are over a page long. Oh my gosh, no. No paragraph needs to be more than a page, needs to be anywhere near that long. You can break it up, but you have to just start playing around with it and you'll get better and better at it, okay? But keep that in, but I have more specific things to say about that in just a second, all right? And so the purpose of the paragraph then, is to develop a point or specific theme. But remember, that point that we're talking about could easily be broken down into subparagraphs. Remember, I think I mentioned that before too, and the theme as well. So always be aware of that. So let's look at a couple of specifics, all right? The development of a point requires discussion and proof. Now, I don't know where I got this number from, but I would suggest that you would need a minimum of 5 sentences per paragraph. Okay? Because again, you've got maybe your topic sentence and then you've got the body proofs or whatever. But again, don't give me 3 proofs each time. Don't feel you have to be that rigid. That's another habit we need to break, okay, that we were taught. All right. So don't feel the need to be that rigid. All right. But when I say say 5 sentences, all I mean is a paragraph should not be 2 sentences. Oh, sorry, and that's something I have noticed as well. Lately, I have noticed that some students are being taught to have almost like a 2-sentence introductory paragraph before their paragraph or section. Don't do that. You lose marks when you're doing that. I don't know why, but I've just noticed that habit. It's creeping into writing more and more. So let me just repeat what I mean by that. Let's say you've just finished, an area that you were working with. Some students then will have this 1 or 2 sentences on their own, almost introducing where we're going next. And then they'll space and then start a paragraph. Don't do that. Incorporate. Sorry, I don't know why I'm coughing so much. So don't do that. I'm glad I remembered that. That's just something I remember from last term. Instead, if you've been taught, to have those introductory 1 or 2 sentences before you get into the paragraph, no, incorporate them together, right? Because in fact, those 1 or 2 sentences, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But if you've been taught that, in fact, that sentence or 2, that's probably your topic sentence, right? Incorporate it. So you should never, ever, ever have 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs. Never. And again, don't email. These are the kind of administrative things I talked about in the first lecture, right? Where students will email me saying, but that's what I was told. Don't do it, right? Again, I'm trying to help you get a really good grade. And so if you keep doing things that you've been taught before, I'm sorry, but you won't get that grade. So, and that's an easy one to fix, right? So no introductory little 2-sentence things before each paragraph. Again, something in the last year or so that I've just noticed more and more students seem to be doing that, which tells me that, in high school, maybe there's a new textbook that is telling, teachers to show writers that. No. Okay. And another thing, by the way, some of you feel like you can use words between each section, like your section headings, and you actually include, like, you'll actually feel the need to have the word introduction before your introduction. Don't do that. You'll lose marks for that. It is true that it is acceptable, but boy, there are so many rules that apply to that. And I'm not going to teach them to you because you do not need them in a first year course. Okay. So again, 2 things there. Make notes. Okay. I do not have that in your notes for you. Do not have introduction and then umbrella term for your next area. And then, don't do that, on its own on the side. Okay. You'll lose marks for that. Then none of those 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs before the paragraph. There's 2 things that I do not have in the notes. You should probably pause. I'm not joking. Pause right now and write those 2 things down, especially if you tend to do that. Okay? Get rid of that, please. All right. Sorry. I sounded harsh there, didn't I? Again, I'm not kidding. The purpose of this course is to help you improve. It's not for me to find mistakes, right? I think I mentioned this before. I would much rather grade an A paper than a D paper, wouldn't I? Save me time. So let's think about these little, they sound like little things, but they're not, okay? All right, anyway, now we're getting to what I hope, if you can read between the lines, maybe we can figure out what a good looking paragraph, would look like. There was no other way to finish that sentence. All right, so when do I begin a new paragraph? That's the most difficult question. But maybe it isn't, because again, we're going to do it backwards, right? We're going to do it backwards. Ironically, by the time you're finished with your outline, you'll more or less know your paragraphs. You'll see what I mean, okay? A shift in focus, okay? A shift in focus will tell you that a new paragraph is needed. A shift in focus. Oh boy, I've got a really good joke. Okay, I've got to do the joke, all right? Going back to irony, I just want to give you a definition of irony. No, I'm sorry, I'll give you an example of irony, okay? What's the difference between a pun, okay, and a fart? A pun is a shift of wit. You have to think about it for a second. Anyway, two different meanings going on there, the literal and the figurative. All right. I just lost my job for that. But anyway, all right. So a shift in focus. When do I begin a new paragraph? Well, when there's a shift in focus. How do I know when there's a shift in focus? Umbrella terms, section headings. You know, well, if I've just finished dealing with that, now I'm moving on to that. There's your first step to understanding paragraphing. So ironically, we've already figured it out. But then the next question becomes, can I break the paragraph, that one area or paragraph, can I break that down into two paragraphs? That's where it gets a bit more difficult. But again, as you practice it, you'll get better at it. You'll see, right? I'm talking about athletics, all right? And I've got a paragraph and it's all about fitness, okay? But I noticed that the paragraph is a page long, okay? But I noticed that in the paragraph, well, fitness can mean a couple of things. There can be mental fitness and physical fitness, right? Okay, well then maybe that's where I can find a break in the paragraph. So that's what I mean. And when we get to your outlines, I think I'll be able to show you that even better. Okay? All right. And there it is right there. If you follow what I've been suggesting about sections, your paragraphs will fall into place. So here's the rule, but it's not a rule. A paragraph should never be more than, or at least should be between, a half a page and 3/4 of a page double spaced. Okay, at most 3/4. But if your paragraphs are getting to be 3/4 of a page double spaced, start asking yourself, can I break this up? Can I break it up into two paragraphs? So if you just look at a paper, right, half a page should do the job for a paragraph. And again, it's not a rule, but again, we're talking about style. Okay. And so finally, my note there, think of when you are reading. You're getting tired, it's late at night, and you have a chapter, one more chapter to read in your psychology book before you go to sleep. And you're in bed and you're comfortable, and you're as I said, you're getting tired. So what do? You do the same thing everybody does. You start flipping just to see how much more to go, because maybe there's pictures, maybe whatever, okay? The problem is, as you start flipping, you see there's nothing but words, and there's 8 more pages to go. What did you just do? You closed your book and went to sleep, right? Well, think of any reader. Think of your writing. If your writing is more than a page long for a paragraph, think of me reading it. It's like, my God, when does this end? So think about that, okay? These are the kind of things you have to start thinking about at university, okay? So again, let's break some habits. So finally then, I want to show you, because we were talking about paragraphing today, I want to show you an outline. Sorry, a template, okay? It's just a template of what a paper looks like. So here now is your introduction. We are finally getting to your introduction. An introduction, okay, should look something like this. You should have a general opening statement. Then you should lay out your areas or your sections, one way or another. Okay, I've got examples, but one way or another. And then finally your thesis. Let's go back then to what we began with. A paragraph should have 3 areas or sections. Well, take a look at the intro. General opening statement, sections of argument, thesis, and lay them out that way. We can play around with 2 and 3. Okay, we can play around a bit with that, and I will. I can't remember if I will today or in the next lecture. I think it might be in the next lecture, but I'll show you how we can play around with that. But those elements must be in your introduction. So again, general opening statement. In other words, I've given you an example of that before. There are many forms of feminism that exist in the world today. So you haven't really said anything, but the reader understands, okay, we're dealing with feminism in some form or another. Okay? And again, that's the sentence that you create out of the blue. Going back to the 15 steps. You're going to need your 15 steps over and over again for the next couple of lectures, all right? So just remember these things. Then you have your sections of argument or your areas, and then you will lay them out in a very specific way, A, B, and C. Well, if you lay them out A, B, and C, then deal with them in the same order. And that only makes sense, right? Section A, followed by section B, or section C, or so on, or whatever. And then followed by a proper conclusion. What does a conclusion do? It simply reinforces what you've just done, and it sums up what you did, okay? It reinforces and sums up, okay? Like, this was what I did, this is why I did it. Many different ways you can do that as well. correct? All right. But again, work on that because some of you will only have like a 1 or 2 sentence conclusion. Try and work on it, right? Just to elaborate a bit, right? Maybe reinforce the sections that you talked about, right? Bring back the notion of the thesis without actually stating the thesis, okay? And then wrapping up. And notice, again, 3 areas. I just made that up, but I'm just saying that's one way of doing it. If you've been told that your conclusions are too tight, too short, well, think about that. And so finally then, yeah, if you follow the next thing I'm about to do, okay, it makes your writing, it just makes your writing, it will help you to improve your writing, okay? And the production of your essays will become so much easier. Again, it sounds like everything is backwards, all right? Oh, that light is really creeping in, isn't it? Yeah, getting in the evening. Anyway, so let's just quickly look now at your outline. What am I looking for in your outline? It's very straightforward. Your outline, okay, should be in point form. We do not want like half your essay in your outline. Really, your outline should probably not take up more than a page. 1 page, okay, point form. We'll be looking for argument, sections, focus, and order, right? And so I'm going to give you like at the end of lecture 8, I'll get more specific with the paper and all of that. But for now, think about that. The outline, okay, we're looking for your argument. Like, what is your argument, your thesis? Okay, it's we're starting to fade here, aren't we? Yeah, it's a bit better. Okay, sorry about that. So we're looking for an argument. Okay, and I'll be doing that in lecture 8. Then we'll be looking for your sections. Okay, and then we'll be looking for your focus. And when I say your focus, I really mean not just the paper, but the sections themselves. Do you keep a specific focus within each section? All right, and then finally order. And again, that goes back to, remember, with the 15 steps where we have to figure out an order of how we put these things together. So, yeah, remember the 15 steps? Sorry, I want to make sure I don't misspeak on this. Okay, so the more specific your outline, okay, we're going to get to the final page in just a second. The more specific your outline, chances are the better your final research grade will be. Okay, so think about that too. Now, some instructors may want more detailed information in their outlines, right? Like each discipline is different, right? But for our purposes, and also this information, for our purposes, make sure you simply include your name and your student number and perhaps your section, all right? But you don't need to worry about having all that information on the left-hand side of the page as you would if you were doing MLA style, because then you've just wasted a lot of space. And I said, well, we really would like your outline to be 1 page. 1 page, that's it. 1 page, point form. So let's look at what your outline would look like. You have your name, your student number, maybe your section. Feel free to put them all on one line at the top. Then maybe you'll have your topic or your title. Okay. Then you might have a tentative thesis. If you've done so much work that you think, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of what I want to do here, then feel free to have a tentative thesis. And again, you feel free to change it once you get the comments back, right? Like maybe you'll want to sharpen it or whatever. And again, that's what the TA and I will do. We might give you a suggestion. You might want to word this a bit differently, or maybe this is not the word you want, right? So, again, sorry about that. But if you don't know your thesis at the moment, and maybe you don't because, remember I said, the thesis will maybe come later on, feel free just to say unknown at this time. Good enough. I'm not kidding. Good enough. Because it's really in the outline, it's really the meat of the paper, the body of the paper. That's what we want to see. Okay? So you begin then with your first umbrella term. Like what are you starting with? And you would probably, and remember, again, there's 1,000 different examples I could give, but maybe your paper is about the environment. And maybe the first thing you're going to be talking about, fossil fuels. So your umbrella term, fossil fuels. Okay, so now you're giving us an indication. You're not going to include that in your final paper as such, but you're indicating to us, okay, that's the first thing I'm going to be working through. It is in the first area as well, you would set up your foundation. All I mean by that, let's go back to the beginning of this lecture today, 49 minutes ago. Well, maybe your key terms, okay? Like terms that you feel you need to define or whatever. So maybe they'll be included there. Feel free to give like a short quote or two, like actual quotes that you will be using in your essay. Then you will incorporate your umbrella term, etc., and how the quotes, all these things work together to prove your case. Now notice, man, sorry. Yeah, allergies, I guess. So notice, in bold, I have, okay, you're going to prove your case, point form throughout in your own words. So don't just give quotes. You'll want to give brief point form notes of your idea, how this relates. Okay, I hope you see what I mean by that, because that's the one thing that people seem to feel is a bit vague. Feel free to include short quotes from sources, from other sources, but make sure your voice is in there showing how these things are going to help drive your argument. Okay? Then we'll do exactly the same thing with your next section. So maybe the first one was fossil fuels. Now maybe the next one is alternative energies or whatever. All right? You see what I'm getting at there. Your next argument, and make sure you're keeping your focus. So now I want to make one thing very clear. Make sure that there is no overlap between your first area and your next area. Make sure that, and that's why I'm asking you to include those umbrella terms for now. You want to make sure they're nice and distinct. Why? Because that way there won't be any repetition. Your focus will be different each time, even though, of course, they'll be connected back to a larger idea, which would be your thesis, right? But if you keep your focus in each section, that suggests development. That's one thing I tend to write on quite a few papers. Paper is not developing. Well, if you do this properly, paper will develop. I'm kind of forcing you to make sure there's development. And then in your third section, that you would do exactly the same thing. You come up with now a third umbrella term. So notice what we're doing here. We're building a paper. We're not writing a paper just yet. We're building a paper. But because you've done quite a bit of work right before you hand in your outline, if you have, and that would be, by the way, if you're wondering, well, where's the grade going to come from really? It's right there. We'll know if, wow, this is really specific. We see the argument. It's all there, right? This student did some work before they handed it in. Whereas an outline that won't get a very good grade, it'll just be a whole lot of hodgepodge ideas off the top of your head with no real, sense of structure development or whatever. So think about all the things we talked about then in your outline. Okay, I'll speak more about this obviously in the next lecture, but I want you to have this here. I actually reversed the lectures. I was going to do lecture 8 as 7 and 7 as 8, but I thought we'd better at least start getting you thinking about these things now. So think about that then. You want to be specific. Make sure that everything, each section is distinct, right? Different from each other, but each one has its own focus. Then the final thing, ask yourself, what order do I put them in? Everything goes back to the 15 steps I talked about. And so at the very end then, right, we would then talk about a tentative conclusion. Unknown, and feel free to simply put unknown at this time. And so I'm going to pause just for a second. I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about the changing face of literacy to show you how you could take an article and put it into that exact structure. So just give me 1 second. I'm only going to take about 2 minutes. All right. When I come back, I'll be only 2 minutes just to show you, like, when you read this, how do we do it exactly? So give me 1 second here. All right. Okay. So literally, I'm just going to take a minute or two. Let's just pretend that we were putting an outline together based on the changing face of literacy. I only chose this one because it just works perfectly for how you would put the outline together. Okay, so I read the entire piece. Then I have to figure out a couple of things, exactly like we did in the first term, right? What is the thesis? What are the sections of the argument or the terms of argument or whatever, all right? And so obviously, in the final paper, you wouldn't have to write about the author's attitude because you might be writing more than one author's attitude. In fact, it'll be your attitude that we'll be interested in. But, okay, well, you should have read The Changing Face of Literacy by now. All right, I sent it to you, and it was on Brightspace. The unfinished book symbolizes the state of attention spans today. So obviously, he's going to be talking about how, basically we're not really a reading society anymore. Right, our attention spans, right, have have been reduced. Okay, I've read the entire paper. So like I said, I'm not going to go through the whole thing line by line or anything, but I noticed as I was reading it, yeah, there were certain areas that the author seemed interested in. The first area, okay, was reading. How, we don't read as much as we used to, etc. Okay, and that's right there in paragraph 2. So in my outline, my first umbrella term would be reading, obviously, right? Then I would pick out some, well, okay, let's do that a bit differently. So I'd start with reading. Then let's say I was writing my own article on this, right? Or actually, no, let's just do it this way for now. Then I might pull out the important points, right, which back up the author's argument. Okay. And again, there's 1,000 different ways you could do this. Then we notice that the author gets into media. There's my second umbrella term. I'm simply trying to show you what do I mean by these umbrella terms, okay? So then we have media. Then finally we have writing. So if you give us an outline, something along those lines, clear umbrella terms, then you have your supporting evidence, quotes that you found, plus your voice, because your voice is this thing pushing it through, right? That should give us then a really good indication of where your paper will fall. And so think about those things. I'll be saying more about that in the next lecture. Remember, I said I flipped the lectures just to make sure that you had at least a feel for the outline process. But I'll be sending you both 7 and 8 at the same time anyway. Like you have them now anyway, right? So feel free to jump ahead and look at some of the other things I have to say in lecture 8. Okay? So anyway, another 55, 56-minute lecture. I think we're good for today. Sorry about that lighting. I'll try and start the lectures a bit earlier from now on. All right? Okay. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye.